So if you go to the People tab, and I'll start in the meantime. Hey everybody, welcome. Apologies for the slight delay in starting here. A few technical issues in terms of recording the session, but I think we're there. Thanks, Dominic. I'm going to share my screen. We've got some slides to walk through just to guide things this time. So hopefully you can now see my screen. All looking good. Thanks, Rog. So it's been a busy couple of weeks since we last had a modules update call. In fact, we've been at KubeCon in Paris as well. But briefly to look at what we're going to chat through today, modules roadmap, version 8.0, 0.8.0, and upcoming releases, bit of an update on the central registry and the work we were doing there. And finally, a discussion around how to define what's included in a module, which is something that has sort of surfaced since even more people started using modules since the release of 0.8. So on the modules roadmap side of things, we've linked to the modules roadmap that we have in GitHub. There's not actually that much to update on as compared to the last call that we had. With us being away at KubeCon and with us sort of tidying up a few loose ends after the 0.8 release, it's actually been fairly quiet, other than capturing a couple of bugs and getting into the details of those bugs, one of which we'll talk about at the end of this call. But otherwise, things have actually gone really quite smoothly with the release of 0.8.0. And thanks to those who've tested ahead of time, we've actually ironed out a decent number of bugs ahead of that release, which is great. The second bullet point there is sort of a key thing we're sort of aware of on an ongoing basis, and that's integration tests and fixes for known OCI registries. Rog and others have been looking at how GitLab, as an example, handles or doesn't handle in some respects certain behaviors that not that we depend on, but sort of the default behavior. Rog actually turned around some really nice fixes for people to be able to use GitLab. Rog, I forget what actually the constraint is on the GitLab side of things. Is it the number of repositories, or I forget?
Well, various registries have various different restrictions on what repositories you can create. So some only allow like one level of naming below your name. Some only allow a single repository. And GitLab in particular also had a restriction of the artifact types. They had an underlying database that would only allow a certain known number of artifact types for their own reasons, rather than, which is a weird restriction, really. But so that they've landed that change, but it's being rolled out at some point. So lots of weird arbitrary restrictions, because there are so many. Being an open protocol and fairly simple, everyone implements their own, therefore everyone has their own quirks.
If only they all used our OCI Go module for consistency's sake. But anyway,
if only.
A quick plug there. But the idea is that we will add integration tests which will run on a regular basis against known OCI registries, as far as we can test against those things, to make sure that we don't regress against those OCI registries, and similarly they don't regress against us, for want of a better phrase. At least we'll get some early notification in that situation of whichever way things are broken. So that is being worked on. As Rog said, though, the fix is people are able to use GitLab today. I think AWS had another slight quirk. But anyway, super happy for folks to raise issues around this and work through where the issues are, whether it be in the client code that we have here, or sort of understanding what the quirks are of perhaps a remote server implementation. Central registry, we'll talk about this a bit more later on, but just sort of from like a high level perspective, and as the last bullet point captures there, we are going to create a separate roadmap for the central registry, because that now is sort of like has a life cycle of its own, independent of the modules roadmap, as it were, because they can and will move along at different paces, especially from a release perspective. We talked about this before, but we're actively working on the publishing of schemas for well-known services, systems, programs, whatever, to the central registry for folks to depend on. Kubernetes, GitHub Actions, workflows, whatever it might be. Especially, sometimes that will be where there's a Q source of truth. In others, like Kubernetes and GitHub Actions workflows, it will be where there is currently some other source of truth, whether it be Go code, JSON schema, whatever it might be. And so we're just trying to work out a few details really around how to do that in a scalable way from especially where there's another source of truth like Kubernetes, and do it in such a way, as we've talked about before, where folks can depend on specific versions of the schemas that correspond to specific deployed versions of systems, etc. So we will have a better update on this next modules update call. We've just been rather busy getting the initial version of the central registry out over the last couple of weeks. One thing we're working on related to that, but orthogonal, is having some sort of documentation generation, i.e. visualization via the central registry for modules, whether they be public or private. Much like package.go.dev allows you to view sort of the documentation for Go code, similar kind of way, we're looking at generating documentation based on schemas, according to some shape or whatever it might be, of Q code that is published to the central registry as well. Again, I think we might even be in a position to have a quick demo of that next time. So in a couple of weeks' time. It'll be very early and proof of concept, but that's kind of the point, is that there's a much larger space to explore when it comes to documentation generation in Q than it is, for example, Go types. Go is considerably simpler in terms of how we generate documentation. Q, much more expansive in terms of what is possible. And the GitHub Actions workflow one is a prime example of how complicated things can get. So moving on to talk about releases. The 0.8 release was, this is just a screenshot of it here. It's all the releases are linked from the GitHub project. And the 0.8 release was really the release we were targeting to have a sort of an actual release as opposed to a pre-release that officially included experimental support for the modules proposal that we have published. As part of the 0.8 release as well, Rog finished up the V3 proposal itself. I should actually, when I publish the slides, Rog, that is a link we should have included actually to the V3 proposal. So just to sort of set the scene clear in people's minds, 0.8 is out. It includes experimental support for modules. Experimental insofar as we haven't yet accepted the modules proposal. Just to set some people's minds somewhat at rest though, are we likely to pull modules at this point? Very unlikely would be my feeling, because we've had such good feedback from folks who have been testing out modules since the end of last year. It's been a really good experimental period, even up to the point that we released 0.8. The decision to do the base modules around OCI seems to be working out well. The central registry experiment that's sort of happening in parallel to it also seems to be working out pretty well. And are thinking about how we'd use the central registry as the equivalent of sort of like a provenance source of truth, similar to the SumDB for Go. Also seems like it's going to stand up nicely as well. So right now it seems very unlikely that we will pull the modules experiment, or to put it another way, things are looking very positive for us to accept the modules proposal. I think probably at the end of today, Rog, we might even signal in the GitHub discussion that it's likely that we will accept it and give people like a week or 2 weeks to sort of come back with any feedback or thoughts or concerns that they might have, similar to the way that the Go project sort of signals it's likely that we're going to accept this proposal. Please raise your hand now if you see any major concerns. So at that point, let's just assume in a couple of weeks' time that we actually accept the modules proposal. At that point, we can immediately cut a release where we take modules out of experimental mode. Whether we actually do that or not sort of remains to be seen. That's sort of more like a sequencing thing at that point. The proposal will be accepted. We could continue with modules in experimental mode to just make sure we get any transition rough edges sorted out. but it's highly likely that I think we would move to make modules a first-class citizen pretty soon after accepting the modules proposal, because we've actually got the two coexisting quite nicely right now. We just need to make sure that we don't break people effectively by taking modules out of experiment mode. So that's the one thing we need to consider. So all being well, we'll accept the proposal. Obviously, very happy if folks have concerns, feedback that they want to raise before then. Really happy to jump on calls to sort of chat through what I know that might be. Otherwise, we've already started in the 0.9 release series. We cut an alpha 1, which includes some fixes. I can't remember. Oh, yes, beg your pardon. The obvious one here is that 0.9 alpha 1 included experimental support for the central registry, and we'll come on to talk a bit more about that in a second. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else. I don't think there is. The 0.8 and 0.9 release projects are in GitHub. They're fairly empty at the moment because we did a whole load of stuff before 0.8, and right now we're just starting to plan out new stuff that will come into 0.9. And 0.8 will probably do a 0.8.1 with any bug fixes or things that we need to backport. But we'll add those to the 0.8 release project as we plan them out. So to talk a bit more about the central registry, the central registry is in alpha testing now. The idea being that folks, for sort of well-known modules, it's really helpful to have a well-known place that you can go to get, especially publicly available well-known modules. And that is why the central registry, that's the sort of the purpose behind the central registry to our mind. There's also a provenance side of things as well, is that in the Go world, they have this concept of the SumDB, which allows you to really know that there's effectively a source of truth that everyone can agree on as to cryptographically what the contents of a public module should be. And that is then an immutable hash, for want of a better phrase, of what that module sums to. And then anyone from that point in time onwards who has what purports to be a copy of that module in hand can check versus that central SumDB that they actually have what is a valid version of that module, just so that they can't be duped into using a bad version of that module, for example. So the central registry will actually be a key part of that provenance story from that perspective, but it's also designed to be a really convenient place for just publishing modules that you might want to share with others. A critical part, however, of the module's design is that it is not tied to the central registry. This is very similar to the way that Go is not tied to the Go proxy. Q modules are not tied to the central registry. It is deliberate that actually you can just, and many folks who started working with modules at the beginning of the year, the central registry didn't even exist at the time. And so they were using, and Rod referred to GitLab, GitHub, Google as the OCI registries in that situation. The idea, though, is that with the central registry, what we'll be able to do is do things like the docs generation that we talked about and more Q-specific things. So, for example, let's just take one example, and that is, say you're working as part of a team and you want to ensure that you don't publish a breaking change as part of the schema. That kind of thing is something that you'd be able to enforce via the central registry to say, hey, we don't want to anyone to be able to submit a breaking change to this particular schema here. This is we're describing as a central registry here. We also have had inquiries about, well, hey, what if we want the equivalent of the central registry, but within our private setup here, within a company setup or project setup? Very happy to have conversations about that as well, because it's not, the central registry will exist as a well-known place for things, and even though it's in alpha right now, that will look to graduate to becoming a live version 2. But it's also the case that the sort of the front end, for want of a better phrase, to the central registry could well be deployed to other situations as well. It's just that it wouldn't obviously be called the central registry in that situation. Perhaps we just call it something like a Q registry. So if folks are interested in that, please just get in touch. As I said, we are please request an invite to be an early tester as part of the central registry. We're just working through a few, as sort of as expected, teething issues as we get more people on board. And so we haven't opened it up to folks to just generally be able to self-sign up yet. So please just ping us, and if you're patient enough to help work through some early issues that we're naturally experiencing as it's gone live. We have some docs that we've already published on qlang.org on how to work with modules in the central registry. This is just on the consuming side of things for now, as in there is a module that we have published to the central registry, and this documentation talks about how to consume that module. Hopefully by the end of the weekend, we will have a couple more bits of documentation up that show how to publish to the central registry as well. It's incredibly straightforward publishing to the central registry. It's just some slight variation on Roger's existing tutorial on how to work with a custom registry. But at the same time, we're going to have documentation up there that shows how to do that, not least because it proves to us and to everybody that that whole workflow works and continues to work. So I think, Roger, have I missed anything on the central registry or anything else before we move on to your part, which is talking about what's included in module? I can't think there's anything else at this point.
I don't think so.
Cool. In which case,
you could say it's the central registry for now is restricted to GitHub repositories. That's
a fair point. I should have included that on well, let's just sort of go back here, because this this screenshot of the central registry, as basic as it is for now, sort of highlights that point, is that the central registry for now, as Rog said, uses GitHub for authentication. It also uses GitHub for authorization as well. What that means is it's limited to, you're limited to publishing modules that are based on GitHub for now. That's absolutely not what we intend down the line. Is we intend, for example, people to be able to publish modules from perhaps that sort of sit under their own domain namespace, myhost.com, for example, whatever. You could imagine that, or GitLab, for example, as being a source of truth for the modules. So for now, the reason we just started with GitHub is that there's a decent number of people who use GitHub. For example, Rust's crates.io has exactly the same restriction in terms of using GitHub-based authn and authz for interaction with crates. And so as a starting point, it seems quite reasonable. And actually, we can make some fairly decent progress as far as the experiment with the central registry is concerned with GitHub-based modules. And so just referencing a point we talked about earlier on about publishing well-known schemas for things like Kubernetes, GitHub Actions, for now, publishing those to the central registry will require us to do so under a GitHub namespace. But we are going to quickly move to actually going beyond that for people to bring their own custom domain, for example. So it just gives us a very good starting point, cheap and easy, and the basis that it's easy to sign in with GitHub. It's easy to rely on a repository's existing authz for authorization, and then we can take it from there. So please send any feedback that folks have on the central registry. As I said, what we will also be doing is using the central registry for folks who then want to mirror modules. I forgot the key word there. Mirror modules from, say, the central registry to perhaps their own private registry in a company setting. Also looking at how to facilitate that kind of setup as well, because they are just OCI registries at the end of the day. And in a similar way that folks might mirror from, say, Docker Hub or whatever, mirroring artifacts to their own registry so they're available perhaps in a sort of an air-gapped type environment, then we want to support the same thing from the central registry as well. Okay, so now, Rog, I think, can I hand over to you for these slides? Is that good?
Yep. So so this discussion was triggered by this issue 2992, where somebody was trying to upload a module, and it failed because the uploader couldn't read a file. In fact, in this case, they were using JetBrains, and the file was .idea, and it's like a lock file. And like, you know, we actually although directories and files beginning with dot and underscore are excluded from consideration in Q module evaluation, they can exist within modules currently, at any rate. And you so then there's the, you know, opens the question out as to what files should we upload if you run qmod upload in your
qmod
module
publish
directory. Sorry, qmod publish. Yep, in your module directory. What files should we actually consider to be part of that module and upload as part of that module? And I think there's no perfectly right answer here. There's no obvious like this is what we should do, which is why I'm bringing it up for discussion here and talking about it. You've just stopped sharing.
I have. Yeah, I just need to quickly fix up something on the slides because you're referring people to a CL as opposed to an issue, and I'm just going to quickly fix that up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Because they'll just get to a broken link if they try to go to that.
That's a good point. Yeah, I
One
manually changed the thing, didn't I? It'll probably go to the same place actually in the end.
No, it definitely won't.
Oh, maybe it won't.
Because one will go to GitLab and one will, Gerrit Hub, excuse me.
That's true.
Okay, cool. Sorry, publishing again, showing again. Tab that. Sorry, Rog.
All right. Yes, good point. Issue 2902, not CL 2902. Where was I? Totally
You've got
lost my track now.
you basically got to the end of the slide where we were sort of saying that there's no right or wrong answer as to what actually goes in, and hence we're bringing it up for discussion.
Yeah, so there are two main threads of thought, I think, here, and they're not exclusive. One is that like the original suggestion was, you know, that it should be VCS aware. It should ignore files that your version control system ignores. For example, we could consider git ignore. We can, you know, fail if it's dirty, perhaps. And another possibility, again, it's non-exclusive, is to just upload the files that actually might feed into your module evaluation. Because if you're importing a package, you kind of know exactly what Q files feed into that package, and therefore perhaps a module doesn't actually need to include the other files. I mean, there are obvious exceptions like README and license, which clearly do need to be part of the module, but there are many others that perhaps don't. So there are a few possible solutions we've been considering, at which point Paul could. So like the first one is, well, you could include all the files. Well, I mean, the first thing to note is that we already do exclude some files from consideration. For example, if there's a module inside a module, then we exclude that. We need to do that, and so we're not proposing changing any of that. So in a sense, that's your base file set. That's what we're considering, and then we're considering perhaps restricting that. And then, so one possibility is, well, let's consider all the files included by your VCS. So if there's a Git, I mean, we're not saying that there has to be a VCS there, but if there's a .git parent directory, then we can say we could do a git ls files. We could find out what's there, and the advantage of that is that if you publish and you actually include in the metadata when publishing what the current VCS commit is, then you don't get anything inside the module that isn't referred to by that VCS commit. You might have more that's referred to by the VCS commit, but you won't have things there that aren't part of that commit. And that you know, there's some potential downside of that is that you could have some local files that are git ignored, and so if you do some testing locally, those would be included. Those would be part of the evaluation. But then if someone downloads that module later, they won't see those files. But actually, most other languages have that issue too. Like if you do that with Go test, if you do that, you know, then you'll have that problem. But so that's one approach. But from my point of view, I quite like the idea, at any rate, and whether it pans out or not, is that a Q module does not necessarily include all the other extraneous stuff, because I think it's not uncommon to define a Q schema as part of coexisting with some other, like, for example, as part of Go code or that sort of thing. So the other possibility is just to include exactly, or almost exactly, you might have some exceptions, that everything that that is used by might be used by Q, because if it's not used by Q, then why, does it deserve its place in the module? Then you're kind of using module as storage for other things, but you can't actually access it without just downloading the module. And perhaps you've got better ways to do that by storing in other places in the registry. So that would be another possibility. You exclude all the non-Q files, but then there's a possible interaction, or there is definitely an interaction with upcoming feature of including embedded files from your queue, because they are non-Q files. But then you can potentially introspect your queue, find out what files are embedded, and include those explicitly too. So it makes it a little more complex to evaluate what files are uploaded, but but the problem with that, of course, is that then you don't have this nice property that everything in a module is at least part of the commit that is the metadata associated with that module. So then another possibility is do both of those. Those both determine a set of possible files, a set of possible files. You intersect all those three things: the base file set, the files included by VCS, if the VCS is around, and the files that might feed into Q evaluation, and then you upload those. But I'm sure there are possibilities that we haven't considered, that like perhaps if any of you have any ideas on this for yourself, or reactions one way or another to these thoughts, then it would be great. Perhaps you might have some ideas to talk about now. I don't know. How does that feel to you? I guess
the alternative is for folks to raise, for those who are also following along on the recording, is to respond in issue 2992 as well, because that's really, I think, for now, where we're gathering thoughts, feedback on these kind of things. I think we probably want as well to do a little design doc or something along those lines where we sketch out what a straw man might look like. Roger, I mean, you talked about option 3, for example, being the intersection of the two here, is that if we've got an experimental implementation, that would also allow folks to play with and see how that will actually work. And so I think we should probably look to try and get something out at some point soonish, design-wise, and follow that quite quickly with an implementation, so that people can see how one option that we choose might actually behave in that situation.
I'll just mention one other thing about the option 1, is that in a sense that's a break with our current behavior, because currently Q is not VCS aware at all. It never executes the git command. So that's definitely a consideration when talking about that option.
I think that's absolutely true. There is some precedent in, for example, the Go world, when building something that it has a heuristic for where it's aware that it's within a Git context, for example. It marks whether something is dirty or not in the actual build result. So I think it's only a heuristic at that point there. And so I don't think we would be talking about it being like a cast iron rule, for example. But so long as the heuristic holds up, then it's something that I think we would probably always want the ability to show somebody, to run a command where they can say or see exactly which files would be included as part of a publish by whatever determination.
Agreed.
Just the one Rog mentioned, the embedding proposal, we actually need to publish that, which I will try and do over the weekend. That is, I've totally forgotten the issue number, but I will add a link to the Slack for folks to follow up on that. That's the ability, much like in the Go world, to just embed non-Q files, generally speaking, into a Q configuration, and to use those embedded files however you sort of so wish within the module at that point.
Yeah.
The reason option 2 makes that quite interesting / exciting is that you have the ability to say include star.txt and have that available as like a map within Q at that point. But of course, that will bring in all TXT files, regardless of whether they include some secrets or not, which is perhaps where option 2 becomes a bit tricky if you've ignored certain files in VCS, but option 2 would bring them in. So I think we need to, whatever design doc or whatever we put out there needs to sort of carefully look at what the considerations might be from a security perspective as well, of any solution. Cool. So 2992, just to refresh, is the issue for folks to add feedback on there. Otherwise, we can just totally open up for any other questions or anything that folks might have. So it feels like I did quite a lot of talking at the beginning.
Yeah, it sounds pretty good on the updates. I'm personally excited to see more on the different, I guess, libraries you're going to be publishing, the modules, especially the process on how we're turning those, say, different systems and modeling them, just so we can, I guess, scale that up. Just like the underlying process, not just the individual artifacts too.
Yeah. So, Cedric, are you sort of referring to things like the Kubernetes side of things, or was there a particular example that you had in mind on that?
I don't know exactly how the modules are going to be generated. I'm assuming for stuff like Kubernetes, you can't just do that by hand, right? So learning how to do that is interesting to me.
Yeah, so the I think there's going to be two parts to that, really. Is that QGetGo obviously already exists,
right?
As part of the open source project, and I think the thing is, there's, at least as we're holding it right now, there's a fair amount of infrastructure required to then do that on an ongoing basis for different setups, right? Mm-hmm. And so we're just looking, okay, well, what does that look like architecturally? Because I think one of the wrinkles within that is like, okay, fine, we can generate it, great, and we can publish it. There's a number of edge cases around, well, what version do you publish it with, and how does somebody say they want to depend on a specific version, given a version of the system that they are depending on? And these are a number of the points we're working through right now. But then a point that's very relevant from a Q perspective, and folks who've worked with the generated Kubernetes stuff will be all too aware of this, is that what Q generates is not perfect. It is absolutely limited by the source of truth that it is generating from. And for example, Go is nowhere near as rich as Q in terms of being able to express various constraints. And it's lossy when it comes to things like interface fields, or fields that have, or types that declare JSON marshalers, etc. So there's a whole load of stuff where, let's just assume it's not going to be perfect. Well, it definitely won't be perfect day one, and it may never be perfect just because it's impossible to retain fidelity between different languages. So in that situation, it's very likely to be the case that in a number of situations, we as humans will want to step in and say, oh, let's also augment this generated result with these human annotated details here to just improve the process. And Q being Q, that's safe because it will be impossible for someone to suggest an augmentation that changes the type of something. It will just make it more strict in some way, shape, or form. So that is like a human process on top of the generated artifacts. And so we're also just trying to sketch out, well, what does that look like? Because you've got a process around how to manage those sorts of contributions as well, on top of the process around the generated artifacts. So that's part of what we're just trying to understand a bit more about, and then get for want of a better phrase, an experimental or quick and dirty version out there for folks to kick the tires on from a consumption perspective, because that's also important. Spoken to Richard and others before, for example, about, let's just say they're depending on version 29 of Kubernetes. and that's the deployed version of Kubernetes. How then do they express from a Kubemodules perspective that they want to depend on exactly that same version of the configuration schema and write configuration against that? And so that's where we've previously talked about dependency islands. And so we're sort of trying to separate the two, though, because dependency islands as a concept can be treated somewhat orthogonally to the generated / published piece. But they do overlap from like the consumer's perspective, where I'm just going to pick on Richard. Richard says, no, we absolutely want to depend on this version of Kubernetes here and have that dependency sort of be treated like an island, because we've got another dependency over here and we don't want the dependencies between those two things to interact. So they're very related, although we can treat them orthogonally. We're trying to make progress in each and get something out as quickly as possible on both fronts.
Right. I definitely agree. Sorry, Richard, I'll get you next. But on what you're saying there, we talked about the importance of getting these libraries out, just getting that network effect going. I see this, it kind of reminds me of like a data enrichment pipeline. You're taking some source and then you're augmenting it or refining it further with human inputs. I definitely think we'll probably need some kind of workflow that's probably supported by Q to take these datas and then see how we want to improve it, like take a source thing and then add like we know best practices for this thing. So like that kind of workflow to make that easy to do. I'll definitely think about that more.
For me, there's a big question about whether that workflow, whether everyone's operating on some central notion of like what the truth is, or whether we have anyone can sort of make their own augmentation if you like, and so there's many different versions that all have their own augmentations that potentially could combine, and I think which one is best depends a lot on what the actual use cases are, I think. So
do you see it like more branching from the tree, like take the machine automated source and then
that's definitely one point of view. Yeah, that's definitely one possibility. I'm not personally I'm not going to say what my views are because I don't want to bias things.
Yeah, definitely good to get feedback from folks on how they are at least mentally holding things right now. And I think the idea is that over the next couple of weeks, albeit we've got a bit of holiday this weekend, so we'll just sort of have to see how much progress we can make in the next couple of weeks, is that we want to start, exactly as you said, Cedric, really getting modules published, albeit let's just call it in sort of an experimental form to help kick the tires on this stuff. So my two canonical examples here are the Kubernetes side of things, unsurprisingly, but also the GitHub Actions side of things, where it has a source of truth that is JSON schema on schemastore.org. Now, I think we could also just chuck in another one for free, effectively, which is where there is a Q source of truth, and we could sort of be a bit. I'm trying to think of a good example where we could do that, because at some point it might well be the case that, let's just take the GitHub Actions one, where it ceases, schemastore.org ceases to be the source of truth, and actually we flip to Q being the source of truth and generate JSON schema from there. So we sort of need to keep that kind of scenario in mind with this stuff as well, because in that scenario, the source of truth is no longer the generated. So not that we need to solve for it right now, but we sort of need to think, well, okay, if that happened, what would consumers do in that situation? Would they have to do anything? Hopefully not, because you don't want them to necessarily change their import paths, etc. So these kinds of things are we're just trying to wrap our hands around a few of the problems right now, do a bit of a scope explosion, but then reduce it down to something where we can go, fine, let's publish the Kubernetes stuff, the GitHub Actions stuff, and just some Q source of truth for another schema. Have folks start depending on that, see how they get on with that. Related to that, maybe we get an experimental implementation of the dependency island stuff there as well, for example. It's just going to help us kick the tires on how this stuff should work together.
Richard's had his hand up for ages.
Sorry, Richard, I talked too long again.
No worries. I think all the things that you all are talking about are much in line with what I'd like to do. And I wish that in this world there existed a kind of central implementation of the Kubernetes language. Right now, the export is not sufficient, as you mentioned, and I can imagine that the best practices, those might be different for each company, but I would like a place where we have additional validations that currently do cause errors in Kubernetes, but are not being validated by Q. So, for example, if your service name is too long, or it's using characters that are out of scope, I'd like to validate those things using Q. So I could imagine kind of a central Q overlay that provides a lot of that safety, and then people can like add layers on top of that as well. So that's where I can imagine like I would be very active and interested in helping maintain that kind of central Q overlay and making sure that it's useful for kind of a general use case. And that would be really important to have those versioned with this overlay works with this version of Kubernetes. If the API changes or adds new things, want to make sure the overlays are always compatible.
100%. So great that you're interested in that as well. So hopefully what we can do, Rog, for a couple of weeks' time is just start to flesh things out a tiny bit here so that we can maybe actually have a few more slides on how we're thinking about structuring things here, where we're going to do the first implementation, etc. I think, Richard, the point you brought up there is, and sort of Cedric and Rog talked about a bit about it as well in terms of like the central overlays. I think that's really where we're going to just feel things out as we go quite a bit, to be honest with you, because I think it's hard to say in a world where branching is always going to be possible. Let's just say we have the raw generated module available somewhere that people can depend on, and they can just just depend on that generated result. Basically, from that point onwards, it's going to be possible for anybody to augment that however they see fit, right? And I think this comes back to the human coordination piece of where there's bits on top there. I'm sort of slightly wary of saying we will definitely have a central place for the Kubernetes stuff, right? Because bluntly, we're not the experts on that side of things. And I think we need to reflect and understand, well, how can the people who have all the relevant expertise sort of feed into that process? So what we can do is say, well, actually, we can improve what's generated at the bottom here. And as I said, that might even flip to being, in some situations, Q is the source of truth. So we sort of need to keep that in the back of our minds. And then it's like, well, how can we get the relevant people, Richard, Cedric, whoever around the table to say, and this is what we should be doing with, say, the Kubernetes space. And so I think a number of folks have expressed interest in it. So what I'd like to do is, rather than us say, this is how it will be done, is open a discussion on, well, this is how we're thinking about the various layers could exist. Where do folks see themselves fitting into this here? And just starting a conversation around that sort of coordination there. Because Timony, for example, and other projects are already using QGetGo or generating Kubernetes things from CRDs. However we want to go about this space, right? I think there's a degree of coordination, and this is actually one of the reasons that another one of the reasons that the central registry exists, right? It helps to facilitate and enforce, in some respects, these sorts of coordination discussions. And so we'll facilitate that as best we can and sort of help provide the tooling in places. But I think we're going to be relying on the experts around the table to help shape what that space should look like, for sure.
This definitely reminds me of, say, like the Linux distro. They have the maintainer model with different packages. And so you're assuming like there's a stable set of tools to actually package these things, but there's expertise, knowledge on those specific applications.
100%.
So we need to work backwards and like, how do we incentivize people to actually do this maintenance work? Well, it has to be the best place to actually use configuration. That said, there's a lot of pain right now in configuration, so we can only go up. I think we can make a compelling experience here. But yeah, we should work backwards on like how do we get people to be maintainers for these things and create good tools to make that easy.
Completely. Josh.
Yeah, I'll just second that. And I think another good example, Linux is one, but if you're familiar with Nix as well, Nix packages in particular, they have this problem and they've spent many, many, many years solving it. So they have a pretty robust maintainer sort of setup that I'm not saying we necessarily copy it, but you could definitely learn a lot in seeing how they do that. But we could do something similar there.
Yeah, I think that's the both are very good examples, and I think it's unsurprising that sort of packaging or repackaging, for want of a better phrase, features in both of those. Cedric, the one reason I smiled when you said the Linux kernel is that, of course, the tricky thing there is, well, let's just take Ubuntu or Debian, for example. If they are packaging, I don't even know what version of the kernel we're up to right now, version, I don't know, 6 something or other. The way that works is that when I install the Debian package on my machine, they then have to augment that version with some Debian specific version tag that says, well, the core version of the kernel is X, but this is like patch blah from Debian on top of that, because they have some things that they're overlaying. And so this is actually one of the trickier things. And Cedric, I was really taken by what you said of thinking about how people want to consume these things, is that if I think about wanting to use Kubernetes version 29, for example, that's fine. But that is just one input to effectively the set of arguments that describes the system that I'm looking to consume a configuration for. So I think there's a number of things to work out here. As I said, there's I think a semi-necessary approach of sort of expanding the scope a tiny bit to make sure we're not going to block ourselves into a corner with some part of it. But then I think we should quickly reduce the scope to say, okay, and what can we concretely do and put in front of people so we can get this stuff up and running as quickly as possible.
Excellent.
Great. Well, it sounds like we have 3 very willing participants, at least in this journey. And for anyone else who's following along, I know we had some great conversations at KubeCon along these lines as well. So it is more than the people on this call for sure. But I think we should aim for that, Rog, in a couple of weeks' time to flesh out sort of the components perhaps of the system a bit, and that will perhaps steer a bit of the conversation. And if we can also think about where we might have experimental implementations or published modules, that'll just help to augment that in some way, shape, or form. Great.
Augment is the right word.
Well, yeah, I'm finding myself using the word augment and unify as part of just normal conversation, and people just look at me a bit more weird than usual, but there we go. Anything else? Otherwise, I think we'll call it a day there. And thanks, folks, for joining. And we'll publish the recording as always. And yeah, if there's any feedback or anything, just please ping it our way. Otherwise, look forward to speaking next time.
Thank you for the presentation. Take care, everybody.
No, thanks for joining.
Thank you.